Hello and welcome to Civil War Weekly, the podcast that answers the question, what happened this week in the American Civil War? I'm your host, Tim Patrick, and this is episode 206, February 17th to February 23rd, 1865. Last week, we had continued action around Petersburg and Virginia. Staying in the Old Dominion, we also had the failed peace conference at Hampton Roads. While maybe sort of a footnote of the war, the Hampton Roads Peace Conference is at least illuminating in the fact that Lincoln has some pretty large concessions that he's willing to make in order to have the war come to a peaceful conclusion. This week, we head back to the Carolinas. We need to check in on what Sherman is doing post-Atlanta, post-Savannah. Before we do that, though, let's talk about our Patreon content. And, of course, this month we have a statistical episode. We had a statistics episode that was a couple of Patreon items ago, a while back. This month we talk about more numbers that I think are interesting or illuminating in the course of the war. So if that sounds like something that would interest you, we've also done memoir reviews, movie reviews. Next month, we're going to go back to the memoir review category, and this would be actually from a federal trooper's perspective. So we have done cavalry in the past, probably not so many memoirs for cavalry, so this should be a little bit of a different memoir. If any of that sounds like it would interest you, there is a link in the show description. Those proceeds do go toward the general upkeep of the show, and they are greatly appreciated. So Sherman had at one point been slated to join Grant's army in Virginia, something that Sherman would be less inclined to do. Not only, in my opinion, did he enjoy independent command, but also he believed that his going to Virginia would not have as great of an effect as moving through South Carolina. South Carolina was especially hated by the Northern troops, as they got the blame for starting the war. Remember in our setup episodes that we talked about how there was already a concept of secession prior to the Civil War, prior to the 1860s, and one of the most notable examples was actually South Carolina, who wasn't necessarily happy with the way that they were being interacted with the federal government, so they had threatened secession. So there's already that kind of stigma over the state, and you could also point to the fact that it does start there with the firing on Fort Sumter. So you add all that up, and there's going to be a lot of animosity towards South Carolina. Sherman would get his wish and essentially march through the Palmetto State unopposed. Now, Hardee was still there with a couple thousand men, and Wheeler's cavalry would continue to operate against their federal counterparts. But one has to wonder why the Confederates did not do a better job to defend against this move. While some troops had been shifted from the sub-theater and Wade Hampton is arriving to take operational control, there's not really a whole lot of organized action. Really, only one crossing of a river would be contested, and even then when the Union troops forced their way across, the defense would crumble. Wheeler's cavalry would try their best in the meantime to eliminate foraging parties, some of which were brutalizing the countryside and civilian population. Sherman's troops would make their way to Columbia, the capital, while there was some thought of heading to Charleston. Now, interestingly enough, Sherman in his early days had been stationed at Charleston, so that is a thought of why maybe he would be against moving on that city and destroying it. Columbia would be surrendered on February 17th, the Confederates evacuating the town. What they did not do was remove or destroy any stores of liquor, something that many of the Union troops would capitalize on. Despite Sherman's promises that there would be no destruction of personal property, the Union troops would start fires and generally begin to loot everything and anyone. Anything of value would be apprehended, only saved in some cases by the benevolence of soldiers who were horrified at the destruction. Civilians were often threatened with violence should they resist. Unfortunately, this would also include some sexual assault, mostly against black women. Civilians would plead for there to be guards posted by Sherman. Some of these would be successful pleas, while some were not. Now, Sherman, for his part, was not trying to wreck the city, but neither did he really do anything to stop it. It has been pointed out that maybe sober troops might have been able to restore order, as they had done in Savannah. We have talked before about how Sherman has these thoughts on how to wage war, and he has been accused of waging total war, and this is actually one of those examples of a kind of pseudo-total war that he has rolled out. I think from Sherman's perspective, right, South Carolina does deserve some of the blame. It is going to go a long way toward eliminating any kind of further resistance in the state, in the South in general as well. So this is kind of a necessary casualty. So while Sherman is seemingly kind of embarrassed at the part of his troops, he's also kind of like, this is sort of a means to an end. We will read a lengthy passage from the diary of Emily Lecomte, as I think it does a good job of describing the events at Columbia. Friday, February 17th. How long is this distress of mine to continue? It is now about 11 o'clock, and the longest morning I ever lived through. I threw myself on the bed late last night, or rather early this morning, without undressing, feeling if I did not take some rest I would be sick. I lay awake a long time in spite of heavy eyelids, listening to the occasional cannon reports, wondering if the shelling would be renewed, and thinking of the tumult there was reigning uptown. At last I fell into a heavy sleep. About 6 o'clock, while it was still quite dark outside, and all in the room were buried in profound slumber, we were suddenly awakened by a terrific explosion. The house shook, broken window panes clattered down, and we all sat up in bed for a few minutes, mute with terror. My first impression on waking was that a shell had struck the house, but as soon as I could collect my senses, I know that no shell could make such a noise. We lit the candle, and Mother sent Jane to inquire of Henry and the cause. Of course he did not know. I went out of the doors. The day was beginning to break murkily, and the air was still heavy with smoke. All continuing quiet, we concluded that the authorities had blown up some stores before evacuating. Whatever the cause, the effect was to scare us very effectively, and to drive away all thought of sleep. We got up an hour later, almost fainting, for we had eaten almost nothing the preceding day. I forced myself to eat a little and to drink half a cup of coffee. After breakfast, the cannon opened again, and so near that every report shook the house. I think it must have been a cannonade to cover our retreat. It did not continue very long. The Negroes all went uptown to see what they could get into in jail or pillage, for all the shops had been opened, and provisions were scattered in all directions. Henry says that in some parts of Main Street, corn and flour and sugar covered the ground. An hour or two ago, they came running back, declaring the Yankees were in town, and that our troops were fighting them in the streets. This was not true, for at that time every soldier nearly had left town, but we did not know it then. I had been feeling wretchedly faint, and nauseated with every mouthful of food I swallowed, and now I trembled all over, and thought I should faint. I knew this would not do, so I laid down a while, and by the dint of a little determination, got quiet again. My mother is downright sick. She has been quite collected and calm until this news, but now she suddenly lost all self-control, and exhibited the most lively terror. Indeed, I thought she would grow hysterical. As for Sally, her fright may be more easily imagined than described. This condition of affairs only lasted about half an hour, but it was dreadful while it did. As soon as I could put on my pocket, I nerved myself to meet them, but by the firing ceased and all the quiet was again. It was denied that the Yankees had yet crossed the river, or even completed their pontoon bridge, and most of the servants returned uptown. They had brought back a considerable quantity of provisions. The Negroes are very kind and faithful. They have supplied us with meat, and Jane brought Mother some rice and crushed sugar for Carrie, knowing that she had none. How times change. Those whom we have so long fed and cared for now help us. We are intensely eager for every item of news, but of course can only hear through the Negroes. A gentleman told us just now that the mayor had gone forward to surrender the town. So what we can get, at least from the first part here, is that there is a hysteria over Union occupying forces. Obviously, there had been some atrocities committed in Georgia. Not all the civilian population was dealt with in a gentlemanly manner, at least by the constructs of the time. So there is that panic. You can kind of get that panic in here. There was not a whole lot of preparation made for the Union Army moving into South Carolina, though. That should also be kind of pointed out. And I think we also have that kind of supply issue here in Colombia that we have seen in other places in the South as well. So we can kind of glean all those things from at least this early part of the diary. Now, I will say also that I do apologize for some of the references toward enslaved folks here, in that there's going to be more of that here moving on. And obviously, this is just coming straight from the diary, so we can take that into consideration. 1:00 p.m. Well, they are here. I was sitting in the back parlor when I heard the shouting of the troops. I was at the front door in a moment. Jane came running and crying, "Oh, Miss Emma, they've come at last." She said that then they were marching down Main Street, before them flying a panic-stricken crowd of women and children, who seemed crazy. As she came along by Aunt Josie's, Miss Mary was at the front gate, about to run out. "For God's sake, Miss Mary," she cried, "stay where you are." I suppose she thought of running to the convent. I ran upstairs to my bedroom windows just in time to see the U.S. flag run over the State House. Oh, what a horrid sight. What a degradation. After 4 long bitter years of bloodshed and hatred, now to float there at last. That hateful symbol of despotism. I do not think I could possibly describe my feelings. I know I could not look at it. I left the window and went back downstairs to Mother. In a little while, a guard arrived to protect the hospital. They have already fixed a shelter of boards near against the wall near the gate. Sentinels are stationed, and they are cooking their dinner. The wind is very high today and blows their hats around. This is the first sight we have had of these fiends except as prisoners. The sight does not stir up a very pleasant feeling in our hearts. We cannot look at them with anything but horror and hatred, loathing and disgust. The troops now in town is a brigade commanded by Colonel Stone. Everything is quiet and orderly. Guards have been placed to protect houses, and Sherman has promised not to disturb the private property. How relieved and thankful we feel after all our anxiety and distress. Later, General Sherman has assured the mayor that he and all the citizens may sleep securely and quietly tonight as if under Confederate rule. Private property shall be carefully respected. Some public buildings have to be destroyed, but he will wait until tomorrow, when the wind shall have entirely subsided. It is said that 1 or 2 stragglers from Wheeler's command fired on the flag as it was borne down Main Street, on the carriage containing the mayor, Colonel Stone, and officers. So here again we have this account, very strong language towards these Union troops as they are occupying Columbia. We've talked about that before, how there's just a general feeling of them as invaders. They're foreigners in some cases. A lot of them are German and Irish of descent, so there is that element to it. And here you have some pretty strong language vividly depicting how this individual, the civilian, is feeling toward the occupation. Saturday afternoon, February 18th. What a night of horror, misery, and agony. It is useless to try to put on paper any idea of it. The recollection is so fearful, and yet any attempt to describe it seems so useless. It even makes one sick to think of writing down such scenes. And yet, as I have written thus far, I ought, while it is still fresh, try, even imperfectly, to give some account of last night. Every incident is now so vividly before me, and yet it does not seem real, rather like a fearful dream, or nightmare that still oppresses. Until dinner time, we saw little of the Yankees except the guard about the campus, and the officers and men galloping up and down the street. It is true, as I have since learned, that as soon as the bulk of the army entered, the work of pillage began, but we are so far off, and so secluded from the rest of the town, that we were happily ignorant of it all. I do not know exactly when Sherman, but I should judge about 2 or between 1 and 2 p.m. We could hear their shouts as they surged down Main Street and through the Senate House, but were too far off to see much of the tumult, nor did we dream what a scene of pillage and terror was being enacted. I hear they found a picture of President Davis in the Capitol, which was set up as a target and shot at amid the jeers of the soldiery. From 3 o'clock till 7, their army was passing down the street by the campus to encamp back of us in the woods. 2 corps entered town, Howard's and Logan's. One, the diabolical 15th, which Sherman has hitherto never permitted to enter a city on account of their vile and desperate character. Slocum's corps remained over the river, and I suppose Davis's also. The devils, as they marched past, looked strong and well clad in dark, dirty-looking blue. The wagon trains were immense. Night drew on. Of course, we did not expect to sleep, but we looked forward to a tolerably tranquil night. Strange as it may seem, we were actually idiotic enough to believe Sherman would keep his word. A Yankee and Sherman. It does seem incredible, such credulity, but I suppose we were so anxious to believe him, the lying fiend. I hope retributive justice will find him one day. At about 7 o'clock, I was standing out in the back of the piazza in the 3rd story. Before me, the whole southern horizon was lit up by campfires which dotted the woods. On one side, the sky was illuminated by the burning of General Hampton's residence a few miles off in the country. On the other side, by some blazing buildings near the river. I had scarcely gone downstairs again when Henry told me that there was a fire on Main Street. Sumter Street was brightly lit by a burning house so near a piazza that we could feel the heat. By the red glare, we could watch the wretches walking, generally staggering back and forth from camp to the town, shouting, hurrahing, cursing South Carolina, swearing, blaspheming, singing ribald songs, using obscene language that we were forced to go indoors. The fire on Main Street was now raging, and we anxiously watched it progress from the upper front windows. In a little while, however, the flames broke forth in every direction. The drunken devils roamed about, setting fire to every house. The flames seemed likely to spare. They were fully equipped for the noble work they had in hand. Each soldier was furnished with combustibles compactly put up. They would enter houses in the presence of helpless women and children, pour turpentine on the beds, and set them on fire. Guards were rarely of any assistance. Most generally, they assisted in the pillaging and firing. The wretched people rushing from their burning homes were not allowed to keep even the few necessaries they gathered up in their flight. Even blankets and food were taken from them and destroyed. The firemen attempted to use their engines, but the hose was cut to pieces and their lives threatened. The wind blew a fearful gale, wafting the flames from house to house with frightening rapidity. By midnight, the whole town, except the outskirts, was wrapped in one huge blaze. Still, the flames had not approached sufficiently near us to threaten our immediate safety, and for some reason not a single Yankee soldier had entered our house. And now the fire, instead of approaching us, seemed to recede. Henry said the danger was over, and sick of the dreadful scene, worn out with fatigue and excitement, we went downstairs to our room and tried to rest. I fell into a heavy kind of stupor, from which I was presently roused by the bustle about me. Our neighbor, Mrs. Caldwell, and her two sisters stood before the fire, wrapped in blankets and weeping. Their home was on fire, and the great sea of flame had again swept down our way the very campus walls. I felt a kind of sickening despair and did not even stir to go and look out. After a while, Jane came in to say that Aunt Josie's house was in flames. Then we all went out to the front door. My God, what a scene! It was about 4 o'clock, and the State House was one grand conflagration. Imagine night turned into noonday, only with a blazing, scorching glare that was horrible. A copper-colored sky across with swept columns of black rolling smoke glittered with sparks and flying embers, while around us were falling thickly showers of burning flakes. Everywhere, the palpitating blaze, walling the streets, with solid masses of flame as far as the eye could see, filling the air with its horrible roar. On every side, the crackling and devouring fire, while every instant came the crashing of timbers and the thunder of falling buildings. A quivering molten ocean seemed to fill the air and sky. The library building opposite us seemed framed by the gushing flames and smoke, while through the windows gleamed the liquid fire. This, we thought, must be Aunt Josie's house. It was the next one, for although hers caught frequently, it was saved. The college buildings caught all along that D's, and had the incendiary work continued 1/2 hour longer than it did, they must have gone. All the physicians and nurses were on the roof trying to save the buildings, and the poor wounded inmates left to themselves, such as could crawled out, while those who could not waited to be burned to death. The common opposite the gate was crowded with homeless women and children, a few wrapped in blankets, and many shivering in the night air. Such was the scene, with this the drunken fiendish soldiery in their dark uniforms, infuriated, cursing, screaming, exulting in their work, came nearer realizing the material ideal of hell than anything I ever expect to see again. They called themselves Sherman's Hellhounds. Mother collected together some bedding, clothing, and food which Henry carried to the back of the garden, and covered them with a hastily ripped-up carpet to protect them from the sparks and flakes of fire. He worked so hard, so faithfully, and tried to comfort Mother as best he could, while she was sobbing and crying at the thought of being left shelterless with a delicate baby. While this was going on, I stood with Marianne in the kitchen. She tried to speak hopefully. I could not cry. It was too horrible. Yet I felt the house must burn. By what miracle it was saved, I cannot think. No effort could be made. No one was on the roof, which was old and dry, and all the while the sparks and burning timbers were flying over it like rain. When the few things she tried to save were moved, Mother took up little Carrie, who was sleeping unconsciously, and wrapping ourselves in shawls and blankets, we went to the front door and waited for the house to catch. There we stood, watching and listening to the roaring and crashing. It seemed inevitable. They said they would not leave a house, and what would become of us? I suppose we owe our final escape to the presence of the Yankee wounded in the hospital. When all seemed in vain, Dr. Thompson went to an officer and asked if he could see his own soldiers burnt alive. He said he would save the hospital, and he and his men came to Dr. T's assistance. Then, too, about this time, even the Yankees seemed to have grown wary of their horrible work. The signal for the cessation of the fire, a blast on the bugle was given, and in 15 minutes the flames ceased to spread. By 7 o'clock, the last flame had expired. About 6 o'clock, a crowd of drunken soldiers assaulted the campus gate and threatened to overpower the guard, swearing the buildings could not be spared. By great exertions, Dr. Thompson found Sherman and secured a strong guard in time to rescue the hospital. Mrs. C., who had been to see after her house, now returned, and sitting down sobbed convulsively, as she told us of the insult she had received from the soldiery engaged in pillaging her home. An officer riding by ordered the men to stop. So broken down and humbled by the terrible experience of the night, she cried out, "Oh, sir, please make them stop. You don't know what I suffered this night." "I don't give a damn for your suffering," he replied, "but my men have no right to pillage against orders." Fortunately, oh so fortunately for us, the hospital is so strictly guarded that we are unmolested within its walls. Oh, that long 12 hours. Never surely again will I live through such a night of horrors. The memory of it will haunt me as long as I shall live. It seems as if the day would never come. The sun rose at last, dim and red through the thick, murky atmosphere. It's at last night on a beautiful town of full women and children. It shone dully down this morning on smoking ruins and abject misery. I do not know how the others felt after the strain of the fearful excitement, but I seemed to sink into a dull apathy. We none seemed to have the energy to talk. After a while, breakfast came, a sort of mockery, for no one could eat. After taking a cup of coffee and bathing my face, begrimed with smoke, I felt better, and the memory of the night seemed like a frightful dream. I have scarcely slept for 3 nights, yet my eyes are not heavy. During the forenoon, Aunt Josie and Aunt Jane came over to see how we had fared. We met as after a long separation, and for some seconds no one could speak. Then we exchanged experiences. They were nearer the flames than we, but they had Dr. Carter with them, someone to look to and to help them. Aunt Josie says the northern side of their house became so heated that no one could remain on that side of the house, and it caught fire 3 times. Being outside the hospital buildings, they were more exposed than we. Once a number of Yankees rushed in, saying the roof was on fire. Andrew, the Negro boy, followed them up, saw them tear up the tin roofing, and place lighted combustibles, and after they went down, he succeeded in extinguishing the flames. A tolerably faithful guard was some protection to them. The view from their attic windows commands the whole town, and Aunt Josie said it was like one surging ocean of flame. She thought with us that it was more like a medieval pictures of hell than anything she had ever imagined. We do not know the extent of the destruction, but we are told that the greater portion of the town is in ashes. Perhaps the loveliest town in all of southern country. This is a civilized warfare. This is the way in which the cultured Yankee nation wars upon women and children. Fighting with our men in the field, this is the way they must conquer. I suppose there was scarcely an able-bodied man, except the hospital physicians, in the whole 20,000 people. It is so easy to burn the homes over the heads of the helpless women and children, and turn them with insults and sneers into the streets. One expects these people to lie and steal, but it does not seem such an outrage, even upon degraded humanity, that those who practice such wanton and useless cruelty shall call themselves men. It seems to us even a contamination to look at those devils. Think of the degradation of being conquered and ruled by such a people. It seems to me now as if we would choose extermination. I have only had to speak once to one of the blue-coated fiends. I went up to the front door to bid Francesca and Nellie C. goodbye early this morning, when a soldier came up on the steps and asked me who was the mayor. Dr. Goodwin, I answered, shortly, and turned away. Do you know his initials? No, and I shut the door rapidly behind me. The State House is of course burned, and they talk of blowing up the new, uncompleted granite one, but I do not know if it can be done in its unfinished, unroofed condition. We dread tonight. Mother asked Dr. Thompson, who has been very kind about coming in and keeping us posted for a guard, but he says it is unnecessary as double guards will be placed throughout the city. Dr. T says some of the officers feel very much ashamed of last night's work. Their compunctions must have visited them since daylight. The men openly acknowledge that they received orders to burn and plunder before they crossed the river. The drunken scoundrels who tried to force their way into the campus this morning have been under guard at the gate, several hundred of them fighting and quarreling amongst themselves for several hours. Poor father. What will he be in this state of mind when he hears of all this? The first reports that reach him will be even exaggerated. It is some comfort for us in our own uncertainty and anxiety hope that he may be safe. The explosion last night was accidental blowing up of the Charleston freight depot. There had been powder stored there, and it was scattered thickly over the floor. The poor people and Negroes went in with torches in search for provisions. When will these Yankees go that we may breathe freely again? The past 3 days are more like 3 weeks, and yet, when they are gone, we may be worse off with the whole country laid waste and the railroads out in every direction. Starvation seems to stare us in the face. Our 2 families have between us a few bushels of corn and wheat, and a little musty flour. We have no meat, but the Negroes give us a little bacon every day. 8 p.m. There has been no firing as of yet. All is comparatively quiet. These buildings are surrounded by heavy guard, and we are told they are disturbed throughout the city. All the day the devils have been completing their work of plunder, but in the hospital, here we have been exempt from this. When I remember how blessed we have been, I cannot be too thankful. We have the promise of a quiet night, but I dare not trust our hopes. There is no telling what diabolical intentions they may have. Oh, if they were only gone, even to the last straggler, what a load would be lifted from our hearts. We're anxious to learn the fate of our friends, but the little we can gather, except from Aunt Josie and Mrs. Green, is through the Negroes, and ours scarcely dare venture uptown. The Yankees plunder the Negroes as well as the whites, and I think they are becoming somewhat disgusted of their friends. Although the servants seem quite willing, it is difficult to get any work out of them on account of the wild excitement. Ah, the dreadful excitement. I seem to stand it very well, but it seems to me that we must all be very ill when it's over. Anxiety, distress, want of rest and food must tell upon us. Mrs. Wilson, with a babe 1 week old, was moved last night from her father's burning house. The Burrows escaped with only the clothing they wore. Many fared similarly. Some tried to save a little food. Even this was torn from their hands. I've heard a number of distressing incidents, but have not the time to write them down. Oh, the sorrow and misery of this unhappy town. From what I can hear, their chief aim, while taunting helpless women, has been to humble their pride. Southern pride. Where now, they would say, is all your pride? See what we have brought to you. This is what you get for setting yourselves up as better than other folks. The women acted with quiet dignity and refused to lower themselves to any retort. Someone told me the following. Some soldiers were pillaging the house of a lady. One asked her if they had not humbled her pride now. No, indeed, she said, nor can you ever. You fear us anyway. No, she said, by God, you shall fear me. And he cocked his pistol and put her to her head. Are you afraid now? She folded her arms and, looking him steadily in the eye, said contemptuously, no. He dropped his pistol and, with an exclamation of admiration, left her. So that's actually the end here of our account from Emily LeConte. So we have a pretty good idea of exactly what your civilian is thinking when Columbia is being burned. And this is not necessarily read here as an isolated incident. I guess this is probably something that other civilians have experienced as we have made our way through the war. We're already here into 1865. So obviously there's all these issues that you have, and you have a pretty good idea of the motivations of the Union soldiers as they're burning the town. Yeah, especially if you're getting a little bit of alcohol in there, it probably does not help. And then you are trying to destroy this Southern pride, and what better place to do it than where secession begins. Here we also have General Sherman writing about the events at Columbia, so you can see just how we have a little bit of a difference here. In anticipation of the occupation of the city, I had made written orders to General Howard touching the conduct of the troops. These were to destroy absolutely all arsenals and public property not needed for our own use, as well as all railroads, depots, and machinery useful in war to an enemy, but to spare all dwellings, colleges, schools, asylums, and harmless private property. I was the first to cross the pontoon bridge, and in company of General Howard rode into the city. The day was clear, but a perfect tempest of wind was raging. The brigade of General Stone was already in the city, and was properly posted. Citizens and soldiers were on the streets, and a general good order prevailed. General Wade Hampton, who commanded the Confederate rearguard of cavalry, had, in anticipation of our capture of Columbia, ordered that all cotton, public and private, should be moved into the streets and fired, to prevent our making use of it. Bales were piled everywhere, the rope and bagging cut, and tufts of cotton were blown about in the wind, lodged in the trees and against houses, so as to resemble a snowstorm. Some of these piles of cotton were burning, especially the one in the heart of the city near the courthouse. But the fire was partially subdued by the labor of our soldiers. Before one single public building had been fired by order, the smoldering fires set by Hampton's order were rekindled by the wind and communicated to the buildings around. About dark, they began to spread and got beyond the control of the brigade on duty within the city. The whole of Wood's division was brought in, but it was found impossible to check the flames, which by midnight had become unmanageable and raged about 4 a.m. when the wind subsided. They got under control. I was up nearly all night and saw Generals Howard, Logan, Woods, and others laboring to save houses and protect families, thus suddenly deprived of shelter and of bedding and wearing apparel. I disclaim the part of my army any agency in the fire, but on the contrary, I claim we saved what of Columbia remains unconsumed. And without hesitation, I charged General Wade Hampton with having burned his own city of Columbia, not with a malicious intent, or as the manifestation of a silly Roman stoicism, but from folly and want of sense, in filling it with lint, cotton, and tinder. Our officers and men on duty worked well to extinguish the flames, but others not on duty, including the officers who had been imprisoned there, rescued by us, may have assisted in spreading the fire after it had begun, and may have indulged in unconcealed joy to see the ruin of the capital of South Carolina. So there you go. You have kind of Sherman saying, well, it was all Wade Hampton's fault because Wade Hampton, of course, was burning some cotton. And we know that there are other places where this happens. The South doesn't want the cotton to fall into the Union hands. Obviously, there are all these businessmen. We talked about this, especially with Louisiana. Talked about it with Ulysses Grant. There are these businessmen who are capitalizing on this cotton, confiscated cotton, that they're then turning a profit off of, or even buying cotton for well-reduced rates and then selling it, normal. Obviously, there's probably more of a demand for cotton in the northern cities now. That's where they were getting their cotton before. And here we have the burning of the cotton. If you really read the first account, it seems like the fires were not an issue there in the morning, and then they were kind of made an issue by mostly Union soldiers. So then you have kind of our highlighting of we did our best to save the city, and there are certain individuals who certainly did help to save the city. You can't actually argue against that, right? But then you have at the very end of Sherman's account here, it might be possible that some Union soldiers decided to aid in the fires, and obviously there was some looting going on, some violence towards civilians. So you're just going to probably have that in the chaos. And you have a very different kind of account that we see in the beginning, very harsh rhetoric for the Union soldiers from the account of the civilian, and then now you have Sherman who's kind of reporting nonchalantly, and obviously Sherman probably is benefiting from downplaying exactly what happened at Columbia, but we can kind of see how, I was kind of joking in some of our early episodes about how Sherman is still kind of a boogeyman, shall we say, for southern states, Georgia in particular. But you read an account like this, and it's not too long ago that the Civil War was fought, right? So you would kind of understand it. You kind of understand where he's getting this very negative reputation from for accounts like this, for events like this. With that, we're going to close out today's episode. South Carolina is being made to pay for the Civil War by Sherman's invading army. With Columbia burned, Sherman's army will then continue to the Tar Heel State soon. Next week, we'll shift back to Virginia. We need to maybe officially end operations in the Shenandoah Valley with the Battle of Waynesboro. If you like what you hear, please make sure to leave a review. Posted in the description should be a link to the website as well as Patreon information. Support for the general upkeep of the show is greatly appreciated. Feedback's always welcome. Questions, comments, concerns. The email is cwweeklypod@gmail.com. Thank you all so much for listening, and have a great week.